Good afternoon. Welcome to the Famous Geographers Corner, a space for sharing and raising awareness of female geographers around the world. We remind you that you can watch and listen to the interviews conducted since 2020 on our YouTube playlist. We are starting the academic year with a very interesting interview presented by my colleague Ana Espinosa. This time we are traveling to South Africa. Whenever you're ready, Ana.
Thank you, Aston, and welcome back to this new 2025-26 academic year, and also welcome back to the Women's Geographers Corner. So today we travel to South Africa with Clare Kelso, our interviewee, and the title of this interview is Climate and Livelihood Changes in Rural South Africa. So Professor Clare Kelso is an environmental geographer whose research focuses on climate and environmental history, rural livelihood, vulnerability, and sustainability. She is currently an associate professor in the Department of Geography, Environmental Management, and Energy Studies at the University of Johannesburg in South Africa. She holds a PhD in geography from the University of the Witwatersrand. Broadly, the focus of the PhD was environmental history, tracing climate and livelihood change experienced by a nomadic pastoral community of Namakwa-Khoi in the Northern Cape over the 19th century. The research was archived comparing the relative role of climate stress to other social and economic drivers of change during the colonial period. Professor Kelso began her lecturing career in 1997 as a junior geography lecturer at Vista University, Soweto campus, and later moved to the University of Johannesburg. The focus of her current research is on rural livelihoods and vulnerability to climate change in the contemporary context, as well as national parks, tourism, and biodiversity conservation. Professor Kelso has supervised a number of master's and PhD students in topics focusing on rural livelihood, vulnerability, and change, on the interface between conservation and local communities, and on the gender nature of the impacts of climate change in rural communities. Underlying this research foci is the center aim to identify sustainable and equitable solutions to complex environmental and social problems. So welcome, Clare, to our space of dissemination, and thank you for saying yes to this interview.
Thank you very much for the opportunity. I really appreciate it. Yeah, I've had a look at some of the previous interviews that you've done, and it looks like a really nice, empowering space that you're creating for women in geography. So I'm very excited for the opportunity to join you today.
Thank you, Claire. It's a pleasure to meet you, and welcome to our space. Following this introduction, I will begin with the two questions we always ask our interviewers. The first question is, when did you know you wanted to become a geographer?
I think it was towards the end of my undergraduate degree. So I initially did a humanities undergraduate degree, which included my majors were English and geography, and a second sub-major of history. And I was fairly unsure. I had actually thought maybe I was going into school teaching or potentially doing something in communications. And then I think geography was just my favorite subject. I really enjoy the fact that it includes both human and physical sciences. And I enjoyed kind of both sides of geography, where I know a lot of people prefer one to the other. I really enjoy both. And also we were doing things or topics in the third year that really seemed to relate to real world problems. So we had majors in kind of economic geography, development geography, as well as kind of, it was a long time ago, but I remember doing postmodern theory. And so we had quite a combination of different specializations, which all I felt really enticed me into continuing with geography. So at the time I was making a decision between a postgraduate diploma in human resource management and doing honors in geography. And it just felt that geography had a lot more potential for sort of solution-orientated, broader work. And so I chose to continue then into honors in geography, and then from there on, further specializations after that.
Okay, fine. The second question is, once you finish your studies in geography, were you clear about what you wanted to specialize?
No, not really. I've taken a bit of a roundabout route. I definitely was interested in looking at women in rural areas and women involved in agriculture. And I had thought of a topic looking at land reform because when I was finishing, South Africa had transitioned into a democratic country, and land reform was being implemented. And I wanted to look at how that was affecting rural women, but I didn't end up doing that at all. I started on a funded project which instead looked at historical rural livelihoods. And I worked in environmental history for my master's, which was upgraded to a PhD. And so my specialization then became actually environmental history and vulnerability. And only much later have I ended up kind of supervising in the field that I was initially interested in, which was looking at I've done rural livelihoods in general, and then quite a bit also looking at women's livelihoods. So it's kind of done a bit of a circle almost, with a lot of other things in between, because in the South African universities, I think we have fewer members of staff. And so we often have to teach some of our specialization, but also a bit more broadly. And so I think I'm still a bit of a generalist. I've got certain specializations, but I think they're a bit still quite widely spread, actually. Yeah.
Before we start with the really first question, I forgot to tell you in the transcript that we would like to. We are interested to know how you are teaching climatology in South Africa, because usually here in Spain it's a subject exclusively taught by physical geographers, but you are from human geography, and this intersect. So we are interested on this.
It is usually taught by physical geographers here as well. I actually ended up with my PhD being in science because I did quite a large section of climate history with the reconstruction of precipitation, a precipitation series using documentary analysis. So, and so I'm a little bit at the confluence, kind of. If people ask me, I normally define myself more as an environmental geographer because I've done a little bit of both, but it is generally taught by pure physical geographers. I teach first year climatology, and then I teach some climate change at master's level, but not sort of pure meteorology. So I kind of introductory climatology, and then also some aspects of climate change. But we do have so certain universities have more of a specialization in meteorology, and then it would be exclusively physical geographers teaching that. And mostly it's pure physical geographers that would teach it here. My first teaching job was at Vista University in Soweto, which was at that time quite understaffed, and climatology was the first thing I was asked to teach. And then I've actually been teaching it since 1997.
You have a lot of experience.
It's a bit different, yes.
Okay, so now that we know more or less your background, so your current stand of interest is centered on the intersection of gender, rural habitats, poverty, and climate change in Africa. So first of all, can you explain us why women are more vulnerable than men to climate change, please?
Yes. So I think it depends. I think it's one of those things that's particularly contextualized. So I think it is women in certain sectors of society that are more vulnerable to climate change impact. So specifically, this research well, I've had a number of different students that I've supervised that have looked at women's livelihoods in rural areas, and specifically where women have other factors that are already making them vulnerable, such as possibly when we're looking at certain under-resourced rural areas, we're looking at women who are already in situations of poverty, or possibly inequality maybe in the inter-household relationships, or different positions, or in culture, within different cultures, they have existing vulnerabilities, and that then can be aggravated by issues of climate change. So specifically, we've been looking at women with land-based livelihoods, often partly subsistence agriculture, or sometimes these women are involved in producing or in agriculture for small-scale commercial purposes. And then because the livelihoods are land-based and often quite small-scale, they're relying on things like rain-fed agriculture. And so if there is an increase, for example, in the unreliability of the seasonality of rainfall, that will then aggravate the food supply issues in the household. The study that one of the PhD students that I supervised conducted, she was specifically looking at households in Cameroon, where although women have provided a lot of the labor in the agricultural setting, so they're the ones, I mean, there's a gendered basis for the division of labor in the agriculture that's conducted there. But women provided a lot of the labor for example, planting and for harvesting, and also for, in some cases, watering crops that were being produced. And what she found was that things like disruption in the onset date of rainfall, which was being picked up as a result of climate change, so an unreliability in the date at when the rains usually start, and then often there would be, the rains would start, and then following that there would be an unusual dry period where the evaporation was very high, and if the seeds had been planted, they could end up not germinating in the way in which they should. And so it was found that those aspects of climate change were really aggravating women's ability to produce for the household, or in some cases for small-scale commercial sales. And so it really related to existing inequalities between women and men within that particular culture, that was then aggravated by unpredictable climate and higher temperatures as well. So kind of it was, climate change was reinforcing or worsening existing inequalities within those areas.
So in 2021, together with Professor Matilda Song, you published the article Gender, Ethnicity and Vulnerability to Climate Change, the case of matrilineal and patrilineal societies in Bamenda Highlands region in Cameroon in global environmental change. So I think you explained there that that intersectionality is gaining momentum in explaining the complexities in rural women's vulnerabilities to the impacts of climate change. So it's not simple to say that there is just a binary analysis of men against women, right? So contemporary gender analysis in the climate change agenda suggests an intersectionality approach which examines different forms of identities and their influence of the uneven impacts of climate change experienced by individuals and communities. So can you explain us better the main result of the research, please?
Yes, sure. So that was related to the paper that I was just mentioning. So her research was really interesting in that she engaged in life history interviews with a select number of women in two different communities with different inheritance patterns. And she used a very in-depth life history method in conjunction with another colleague at UJ, Professor Camilla Naidu, who is a sociologist with specialization in gender. Well, she's currently the Dean of the Faculty of Humanities, actually. We sort of decided that a life history methodology would be an interesting methodology to look at the trajectories of women's kind of experience over time. She was somewhat limited because life history can look at the same people over a long period of time and go back. She did have repeated visits, but what she more engaged with was women narrating their experiences. But she looked at very kind of in-depth aspects of women's lives, including marriage, education, where that had been possible or where it hadn't been possible. She looked at the culture of polygamy in those particular communities, and then took these very sort of long life stories. All of the women that were interviewed, or it was either repeat interviews. She also used focus group methodologies, so quite in-depth methodologies. And then after that, looking at a sort of long-term thematic analysis of what the main issues were that aggravated women's vulnerability in these two separate communities. And intersectionality just became important. It's obviously a kind of a feminist theoretical perspective and methodology. And it just became very useful in understanding the complexity of vulnerability that women experience. And also, it's not necessarily straightforward. Like it's not like the women that were being interviewed necessarily saw themselves as victims. We very much also investigated where they were able to have agency in terms of defining their circumstances. And so where intersectionality became very important was just in looking at the fact that gender is often only one aspect of what creates vulnerability for women in these societies. There are also aspects of the community being not a wealthy community, and so the households themselves, including the men, were often vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. And then there were other aspects such as class, race, language in Cameroon. This was the English-speaking part of the Cameroon, where currently actually there's political upheaval, and there was at the time when she was doing her investigation. So it was really able to look at the fact that gender is only one dynamic that aggravates vulnerability. And then within gender, we looked specifically at what were the aspects that made women more vulnerable to men, which included this household division of labor, who provides labor. Also, access to and control over land was another factor that emerged. And then sort of the way in which inheritance works if a woman loses her husband was also very important in terms of access to land. Then also sort of the broader political factors. So it really provided a useful framework in terms of understanding the different levels at which, or the complexity of vulnerability and the different levels at which it operates.
Thanks to the following answer is, according to you, which would be the main actions needed to reduce the gender gap among men and women to tackle climate change?
I think it's also very complex, and the one thing I think that even the historical research that I've done has shown me is the importance of a local context and very sort of locally specific interventions, as opposed to often it might not be that similar in your context, but we often get very large scale interventions in rural areas that are kind of similar for all households. So it can either be a government intervention or an aid agency intervention, and it often is sort of developed elsewhere and then imposed on all rural areas without looking at the local context. So I feel like context is specifically important. But what we found with the research on female vulnerability specifically is that access to land, but not only access to land, because most women that we were interviewing did have access to land on which they could provide the labor for agriculture, but not just access to, but also ownership and control over the decisions in relation to the production of different crops and things in that space. So often they would have access to land, but that didn't mean ownership and control. Whereas ownership specifically seemed to give agency, and it also then was land ownership was able to mobilize other financial supports. So that emerged from, I'm talking now from various different studies. So I think local level interventions that include kind of control over decision making and control over land, and then also access to financial support and credit, either financial support in terms of kind of small scale savings, which women throughout South Africa certainly get involved in, or alternatively kind of financial loans programs that also can assist, because agriculture obviously is quite inconsistent, and especially in the context of climate change, even more so. And then we also found that women who had received education had a lot more alternative livelihood sources. So they were able to diversify, whereas in certain cases, there were women that had only had access to primary education, and they seemed to be worse affected over the long term, whereas access to education tended to result in more agency for women. And then I think just giving women a voice as well to define their own priorities, rather again than imposing things that external actors believe to be what's needed, but rather doing sort of bottom-up strategies that listen to women's voices in specific contexts.
Mhm. Yeah, so finally, the start and the end of everything is education. Yeah. So,
It's very important.
so in 2007, you co-authored a study on climate change about the climate of the region of Namaqualand between Namibia and South Africa in the 19th century, using historical documentary sources such as unpublished missionary journals, letters, and travelers' writings. We found that very interesting. For us, it was very, yeah, very different, of course. So can you tell us more about your findings and the methods you used to reconstruct the climate of the region, please?
Absolutely. So this method of reconstructing climate is used where there are a lot fewer historical sources. So the rainfall records for South Africa, for example, some of the earliest are really from the late 1800s. So there isn't a very long sort of history of measured meteorological records. Even temperature records and pressure records, a lot of them were, the initial ones were made by sort of early travelers. And so there isn't much in the sense of a long-term historical measured record. And there are quite a number of gaps in what exists as well. And so as a result, we're looking at various proxy records. I believe, but it's not my specialization, that there are not as many trees that are good for tree ring historical records in Southern Africa as well. It's not my specialization, so I won't explain exactly which ones are and aren't. But some of the historical records that are available elsewhere are not as accessible in Southern Africa. And in particular, we've got this sort of short period of measured meteorological data of rainfall and temperature. And it's quite spatially sparse initially. And so one of the proxies that has been used is documentary resources. So it's literally a question of reading journals, diaries, newspaper articles. In the case of this research for Namaqualand, it was the early colonial period. I started the research looking in the late 1700s with the beginning of the documentary sources referring to that area. That was largely travel writings. And then missionaries actually settled in that area. And so you get a more reliable sort of long-term record from that, because they write diaries that are reporting more frequently. And so it was literally a question of looking through all of the records that they wrote for references to rainfall and climate. And they would refer, especially so what is an issue in this area, it's a semi-desert, semi-arid area, is frequent drought. And they would definitely refer to the drought and then the impacts of those droughts. And that's the record that I reconstructed using. So any reference to droughts, to wet periods, to the impacts of crop failures, or in this case, it was a nomadic pastoral region. So they would move more widely with livestock when it was really dry, and they would, when it was wetter, they were able to stay more locally. And so all of those kind of descriptions were brought together to then reconstruct wetter and drier years. There were some years when there weren't records available, and then others where it was quite clearly we could see. So I also looked at creating confidence levels, how confident I was in the results, depending on the number of sources that referred to it. It is actually a method that has been used more broadly subsequently. And then there's been efforts to bring those documentary records together. But it was a way to reconstruct basically a proxy precipitation data set where there wasn't other data available. And then that was compared to historical records of the El Nino Southern Oscillation, and to see whether there was the influence of that on droughts in Southern Africa, which has been shown in the contemporary period. And then also that was compared to a similar study that was done on the Western Cape, just to look at periods of widespread drought.
Well, this summer we got some homework for preparing your interview, and we listened to the interview you granted to Humanity Africa in 2021. You talk about a very interesting topic, and we would love to talk with you about your perception of the existing gender differences in academia. You mentioned how women are usually more devoted than men to invisible tasks or very time-consuming academic activities like teaching that are important, but they don't count so much in the performance metrics for university staff.
Yes, I mean, I think that is still the case. I think often female academics will take on additional administrative tasks. They will often just see where there's a need and volunteer to get involved in those things. And certainly, I don't know, I assume it's similar for you in universities in Europe, where the main metric really is on publication output, in terms of when you look at going for promotion, or performance management and kind of key performance areas. And often the time that's put into teaching is extremely important in terms of the student experience and student benefits. But it isn't necessarily always as highly valued. I know there have been initiatives. We now put together teaching portfolios. There have been initiatives to kind of look at improving the way in which teaching is quantified in our performance, but it still is sometimes that it isn't valued as highly. And I mean, I think women often also choose to maybe progress more slowly in their careers if they are choosing to have families as well. And I feel like that should still be an option, because sometimes we've gone the other way where it's let's kind of push everybody through at a similar speed, which I think also we should be allowed the element of choice if we would prefer to maybe progress more slowly because of other choices of how we want to devote our time. But I do think that there shouldn't be a glass ceiling where maybe more of the time-consuming administrative tasks of a department are kind of assigned to female academics because, well, I mean, no specific reason, I guess, but often it can just be this expectation that women need to, or that they take on these kind of activities and that they devote more time to. I'm scared of stepping into gender stereotypes, but kind of the more sort of nurturing and necessary daily tasks often get taken on by female members of staff. And it's quite a hard thing, I think, to guard against that because it can just be something that's almost not overtly visible. And that then can just slow the promotion of female academics. And so I guess it's kind of good to check in with one another and make sure that we're also prioritizing the academic aspects of research that ultimately are more measured when it comes to promotion.
Yeah, that's completely true. Yeah, and we really wanted your personal opinion because we felt really represented when we listened to your podcast. So, Claire, you are the first woman based at a South African university to be interviewed in our Women's Geographers Corner. And maybe the question is too wide or too big, but can you tell us the main challenges geography faces in academia on the African continent?
I think one of the things I've noticed, and I'm not sure if it is relevant everywhere or not, but that we have a lot of students who come from a diversity of backgrounds and they've maybe got into a certain degree, but they haven't necessarily thought about where that degree is taking them in the future. And so we often have students that once they're into studying geography, they want to look more for professional qualifications. So something that directly aligns them with a very specific job or career. And so they've come into a general degree and then they want rather to have some sort of a professional qualification. Whereas I think geography can set you up for a number of different possibilities in terms of careers from town planning, government, policy, into aspects of maybe rural development in terms of what we've been talking about now, climate change, divisions in government. I think it can set you up for a lot of different careers, but we often have students then once they're into the program wanting a more narrow professional focus. So we get a lot of people choosing electives in GIS or environmental management specifically. So we also have environmental management and energy studies so that they want to specialize for quite a clear career path, which they don't necessarily anticipate at the beginning of the degree. And so that's something that I've just noticed to be a little bit different over the many years that I've been teaching now. And then also, I think often we're teaching a set of skills that are problem-solving skills that can be applied in a lot of different contexts. But then that understanding is not necessarily there with students. So they kind of looking for that narrower focus. So that's just one observation over time. The other thing really just in the South African context is the fact that our education sector is under-resourced. It's far too small, honestly. The university sector is really too small. I didn't look at the figures, but we have thousands of applications for a very small number of places at all of the South African institutions. And so we really don't have the capacity to accommodate the number of applicants that we have. So that is difficult because education really for so many people is what is life-changing, not only for them, but for their family circumstances. One person with a degree often is able to kind of support and transition families that have been living in poverty. And so it can make a huge difference. And yet we just don't have such great capacity to accommodate everybody. And then we're also just under-resourced. The university sector is not as under-resourced financially, but a lot of the schools are. And so we get students coming that aren't necessarily fully prepared for university. And then in the 3 years that we have, we're trying to kind of help with some of the grounding that they should have come with, as well as then getting them up to exit level university qualifications. So just the under-resourced education sector in the country in general is problematic. And then I think it just can also be that it's very challenging for students because some of them will come from a background where although they've got marks, they haven't necessarily had all of the grounding. And then it can be a very difficult transition from school to the university sector. So yeah, those are the first things that would come to mind for me. And then also the pressure to sort of, but I'm sure this is everywhere for all academics, the pressure to kind of balance your research with your teaching, with your administration, and kind of the different pressures, supervision load. And we often supervise quite broadly because of the different specializations that students want. So I think it can be quite tough on academics balancing all of those different things as well. And so it just means sometimes we are quite thinly stretched. But I think that might be the education sector everywhere, though.
So I think all of us are very stressed. But I was thinking that then what you suggested is that it's more a vertical change in the whole education system. So starting from the primary and secondary education, so preparing them better for getting to university with a better knowledge and a better understanding of the science, right?
Yes, yes, especially the science research in South Africa is where we just don't have sufficient teachers in science and maths. And so often, I don't know where geography is housed in your university, but with us it is in the science faculty. And a lot of students come without that grounding in the science that's needed just to make it a much easier transition into university.
We are in the Faculty of Arts.
Oh, okay.
So maybe for us it's not so important because I'm from human geography, but maybe for the section of Aston is physical geographer, maybe it clashes. It's not so smooth, the transition to
It's quite strange.
yeah.
Okay. Okay, so now that we have finished the main part of this interview, we would like to ask you another questions, which will allow our audience to know you a little better. So, short questions. Can you give us the name of a historical figure who made you an impression?
I think this might be cliched for South Africans, but I would have to say Nelson Mandela. I grew up under apartheid South Africa, and the transition to democracy peacefully really did feel like a pretty miraculous event at the time. And I have, so the first time I was able to vote was actually the referendum on ending apartheid. And then the first time I was able to politically vote was the first democratic elections in South Africa. So that's always been very sort of special to me. And yeah, so I would have to say, I mean, it was enabled by the way in which he approached everything once he was released from prison. And so I think that would have to be the person that made an overall impression for me.
Thank you. A historical female scientist?
I realized the person that I've chosen is actually more of an historian, an environmental historian. She's she's emeritus professor now based at UNISA. Her name's Professor Jane Carruthers. She did some pioneering work in environmental history in South Africa, starting with the history of the formation of the Kruger National Park. And so with my work for my PhD, really becoming environmental history, in a way, although it's a geography degree, but it was a lot of environmental history. She was very influential. Her work kind of in the field of environmental history in South Africa, really a pioneer of the field of environmental history in South Africa.
Mhm.
A reference in your development as geographer.
I have far too many. I think I think the work of political ecologists was very important to me. So I've realized a strong theme of references that have been very useful for me has all been kind of at the confluence between physical and human geography. People who've looked at the way in which power dynamics shape people's access to environmental resources. So I had people like Michael Watts and Piers Blakey's work on kind of looking at political economy of soil erosion and the socio-economic kind of drivers of vulnerability. And so it's kind of people who have looked at yes, I think the interface of physical and human geography and how that is really often shaped by political and social factors rather than just pure physical factors. So that seemed to be kind of the theme. So when I was in honors, it was the work of Michael Watts, Richard Peets, Piers Blakey, and then Robert Chambers, who looked at rural livelihoods, but listening to local people's voices. And then more recently, I think it's Robin Lachenko and Corinne O'Brien who look at vulnerability and globalization and inequality. So I recognize the theme was the interface between kind of the political and social and kind of access to environmental resources. So it was kind of a group of different scholars.
A book or a reading?
That I think a book that has been quite seminal for me is Mike Hume's book, Why We Disagree About Climate Change. And again, it's at the interface of physical and human geography. But just in terms of yeah, him looking at why climate change. So I came across a lot of climate change denialists earlier on in my career. And he really looks at people's deeper motivations for climate change denialism, which I found fascinating. And then he also sort of challenges in that book that we should be solving problems of inequality now, not only within the context of climate change. And so I just found those arguments really valid and compelling. And so it's always been one that I've held quite close and have used in my teaching.
Seems interesting. We would like to have the reference.
With pleasure.
A typical dish from your hometown or village or country.
Okay, that one has to be a braai, which I don't know if you know the word, it's like a barbecue, except we obviously think it's better. So it's outdoor cooking of different meats with salads, and then the side would be mieliepap, which is a South African staple, with a relish, or there's various different kinds of relish, some sort of tomato relish, or it can be sort of beans relish, often more than one. That would be the food that probably absolutely draws South Africans together. So, and also because of our almost always lovely weather, it's always outdoor kind of communal cooking.
Mhm. And just for finishing, an unforgettable route and place, and it shouldn't be necessarily from South Africa.
I think it still will be. We've got it's lots of diversity here. Also, I've not really traveled too much except for work. So I think one of my favorite routes, we often go to the coast in the holidays. It's quite a long trip. It's well, because we camp, so it's a bit of a slow trip. So from Johannesburg to the Eastern Cape Coast, which goes kind of from the plateau through the Karoo, which is semi-arid to arid, and then down to the coast of the Eastern Cape. So it's just I guess it's always summer holidays, and so there's that element to it. But we normally take 2 days to travel, and kind of the change of the scenery. Well, we just stay overnight because I think you can do it, but it's about a 13-hour trip by car, and so we just break it up. And yes, just to see kind of the scenery changing as we progress, and then ending up at the coastline, which, because Johannesburg's far inland, it's kind of become my annual favorite trip. So I really enjoy that one. And then just visiting the coast, that whole coastline is really beautiful, but the Eastern Cape Coast specifically, but a lot of the coastline is really beautiful. So that's one of my favorite routes.
But did you travel 30 hours one way
13.
and back? 13. 13.
13. No, 13.
Okay.
Definitely not 13. No.
Okay.
It's 13, so it's over 2 days, yes.
Mhm.
I mean, you can do it in one go, but I feel like it
That
would
would
be
be too
very
much.
tiring.
Yeah, too much. Okay, so we are finished. We have already came at the end of the interview, and we are very happy because this summer when we were reading and listening to your podcast, we were really looking forward to listening to you today. So the day came and we are here, and we are very happy that you wanted to be interviewed by us in this space of dissemination.
Thank you. Thank you so much for the opportunity. It's really a lovely space, and I enjoyed the balance between kind of the academic part of the interview and then the personal part, which is really lovely. I think what you're doing is quite unique from that perspective.
Mhm.
Thanks a lot, Claire.
We are very happy with this program, and it's one of our favorite things to prepare, and we do it with all our love.
Fantastic. Thank you.
So have a nice day, and see you back other day.
Thank you so much. Enjoy
Nice
the
to
rest
meet
of
you
the
too.
day. Thank you so much.
Bye.
Bye-bye.